So let me read all your comments. You said what I am speaking of is pure factual history. God is not a man. We don't have a God story because we can't write a story about someone who's not a man. God doesn't have legs or a color. Right. Well, that's what Islam says too. Yeah. So, let's see. And then you said, I left you 100% facts of the man manipulating religions, and not none of it tells the story of the spirit source we call God. Source, okay. I spent a total of 2.5 years in Iraq. There are no white people there. They get called sand Negroes. They are factually brown. God is spirit, consciousness. The history has nothing to do with God. Okay, so just because and then you said, when I commented to you before, which was what, yesterday, you said the white Jews migrated from Europe and Germany, white Christians to Israel. The Arabs and Muslims know they were put there and backed by the U.S. white Christians. So that's what your issue is with, the white Christians. Which yesterday I replied, or earlier today, replied to you about how, yeah, this is what you say, is that the Israelites were all black, okay? But then you're saying now in this comment that God couldn't be a man and God doesn't have a color. So which is it? I think what it is it's all about getting Americans, or let's say getting Christians. First of all, you make it very clear the Middle East doesn't like Christians, nor likes white Christians, most particularly, right? So we would be the last people that would know what God is. And you know what? Hell, I'm not going to dispute you. You probably do say, oh, your facts go back far. But what you miss is that, see, Jesus, the true God, had to come in human form, or the entire world would have been lost to this ancient religion, or this ancient religion, or this ancient religion. Yeah, that's why Jesus came, though. So people wouldn't go down these paths. Especially this one. This one morphs and is everywhere. I mean, this goes back to that ancient religion. Yeah, the 7 chakras, that's all in the Hinduism stuff. Then goes back to the deities, loves to reinvent itself more. I mean, that's what Jesus came for, was to prevent people from falling into these traps. Same old ancient religion. It adds whatever it needs to for the present day and time. Yeah, to make itself look inviting and special, and then this becomes this instead of chakras. No, now they're energy centers. Yeah. And we've incorporated more into science through the yoga end, and then they'll go as far as to, this, it's still the same old ancient religion. Yeah. Human design energy centers. And then this, of course, takes the shape of this, just like you were talking about with the spirit is conscious, or spirit is source, and God is consciousness. Yep, that's what all this is about, the levels of consciousness. And based on the levels of consciousness, it determines, what dimension you're in, or, oh, you're still in 3D dimension. You can't see the truth. We're moving and shifting to a 5D dimension. And then it's all about this. That's what you're talking about. But you'll talk about anything, right? It's all about, you don't like the whites. And I'm not going to say what you're saying. Yeah, you go back to the ancient religion, but that's why Jesus came, is what I'm trying to say. I mean, this is what's being pushed now. People, they're going to raise in consciousness so much that, waking up from the sleep, seeing the truth, and they're going to ascend and vibrate and raise their frequency up into the ascended master, the consciousness, the source. Because it's all about this. It's not about Jesus, although you'll use Jesus when it serves you to say, just like Islam will say that, yeah, we know Jesus, he was a prophet, he had a good message, but he wasn't a God. But then, Islam will completely sacrifice its own values to align with religions that have a bunch of deities, because it's really not about them having a value system. I'm not saying Arabs don't. Based on the stuff you're saying, they clearly don't like white Americans, definitely white Christians, right? Of course not. But since your knowledge is so great about the Middle East, or, you said you were from Iraq, I just thought you might be interested in this. We talk about slavery by the hands of the whites all the time, but what is never mentioned is the enslavement of our people by the Arabs. That slavery was more brutal than our enslavement by the Gentiles. Over 28 million Africans have been enslaved in the Muslim world during the past 14 centuries. While much has been written concerning the transatlantic slave trade, surprisingly little attention has been given to the Islamic slave trade across the Sahara, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. While European involvement in the transatlantic slave trade to the Americas lasted for just over 3 centuries, the Arab involvement in the slave trade has lasted 14 centuries, and in some parts of the Muslim world is still continuing to this day. A comparison of the Muslim slave trade to the American slave trade reveals some interesting contrasts. While 2 out of every 3 slaves shipped across the Atlantic were men, the proportions were reversed in the Muslim slave trade. 2 women for every man were enslaved by Muslims. While the mortality rate for slaves being transported across the Atlantic was as high as 10%, the percentage of slaves dying in transit in the Trans-Saharan and East African slave trade was between 80 and 90%. While almost all the slaves shipped across the Atlantic were for agricultural work, most of the slaves destined for the Muslim Middle East were for sex exploitation or as concubines in harems and for military service. While many children were born to slaves in the Americas, and millions of their descendants are citizens now in Brazil and the USA to this day, very few descendants of the slaves that ended up in the Middle East are alive at all. While most slaves who went to the Americas could marry and have families, most of the male slaves descended for the Middle East were castrated, and most of the children born to women were killed at birth. It is estimated that possibly as many as 11 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. 95% went to the South and Central America, mainly to Portuguese, Spain, and the French possession. Only 5% of the slaves went to the United States. Yet my people read a book produced by an Arabic prophet and bow to his name when he hated our people and forced our people to convert by violence. In fact, there are still Black, African, Hebrew slaves owned by Arabs in some parts of Africa today. So, maybe everything you say is factual. But there's a reason that America has been protected by God. And the number one religion practiced here in America, proudly I will say, is Christianity. But there's people wanting to come in, Islam Nation, Muslim Brotherhood, and for a long time have been wanting to tell us that everything's made up. We have a bunch of science and universities that want to do that too, because they're all too stupid to see the truth. Yeah, well, there's nothing but violence day in and day out because of all the terrorist organizations throughout the Middle East. And then you look at America and you can't figure out who the real God is. Well, I'll pray for you.